Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Welcome to another edition of Theology Curator. My name is Kurt Willems, and I'm excited to be on this journey with you. We today are going to go back to something that I had started doing back in January, and it's almost embarrassing, but with COVID-19 hitting and some of the things that we've had to walk through, I feel like it's something that got put on the back burner, but I want to make sure that you get the second half of. So I started a mini-series called The End, Doom, Gloom, and Jesus. And so you have episode 83 you can go back to from January 15th, and that's where you need to start. If you have not been on this show or honestly, if you don't remember the content from there, it's only about 25 minutes or so to listen to. So go back there, listen to that, and then this is going to be the follow-up, and here's what it's all about. We're talking about the so-called end times, and specifically this moment in Mark 13 and parallel passages. It's sometimes called the Olivet Discourse, and we're asking questions about what Jesus is really up to there. My bias is that it is not about end time stuff at all. And if you've listened to the show for any amount of time, you know that I affirm the return of Jesus, the resurrection of all human flesh, the final judgment and healing and reconciliation of all creation. I believe in this future return of Jesus. I, however, am not a dispensationalist. I don't read Revelation as a futuristic document, except for the final couple of chapters that point people in the first century towards a hope that could empower them in the midst of suffering. So I am one of those people who is not really, I'm not really comfortable with the left behinds of the world and some of these rapture theologies that are out there. If that's your view, that's fine. It's totally fine. Maybe today you just get to hear an alternative option. And so if you want to do that and you want to step in, I do recommend going back to episode 83 back in January, The End, Doom, Gloom, and Jesus Part 1. And this will conclude this little mini-series, and this will be part 2. I hope you find it helpful and interesting, and we will have more interviews and more other forms of content coming up soon. So have a great rest of your day and enjoy this listen. In the last session, we talked about doom, gloom, and Jesus, and that was a part 1. And a lot of what we talked about was the language of tribulation and the context of what's happening that leads to this passage of scripture we call the Olivet Discourse. Mark 13 is one of 3 places where Jesus describes something that sounds like the end of the world. We've often heard it interpreted as the prototypical text that talks about what it's like when the rapture happens. Some people are going to be taken and left. We're going to talk about some of that today. And what I want to do right now is I want to just jump right into some content. Otherwise, we're going to be talking all day, and you don't have all day, and my voice doesn't have all day. So let's jump right in. And so to frame this, let's step into Matthew's version of Jesus's prophecy, Jesus's words, this apocalyptic text, and that's in Matthew 24. And what I want to read right now is 15 through 22, and I'll make a point or two, and then we're going to step into another sort of text within this part of Matthew 24, and we'll eventually work our way through some of the significant passages here. So this is what Matthew 24 says in verse 15 and following. Quote, "When you see the disgusting and destructive thing that Daniel talked about standing in the holy place, the reader should understand this. Then those in Judea must escape to the mountains. Those on the roof shouldn't come down to grab things from their houses, those in the field shouldn't come back to grab their clothes. How terrible it will be at that time for women who are pregnant and for women who are nursing their children. Pray that it doesn't happen in winter or on the Sabbath day. There will be great suffering, such as the world has never seen and will never see again. If that time weren't shortened, nobody would be rescued. But for the sake of the ones whom God chose, that time will be cut short. This, my friends, sounds like Left Behind's about to be on. This, my friends, is a scary sounding passage, and historically, it has been read in a way that puts it all towards the future, like our future. But I want to unpack some of the things that come up. And so one of the first things we need to do is we need to look at this language of, and I'm going to use the language, abomination of desolation. The translation that I read does this really well, and it just calls it the disgusting and destructive thing. And I love that it says it that way, but because we've all heard abomination of desolation, that's probably what I'll utilize in this conversation more often. And that, again, that's in verse 15. You can go check it out. Depending on your translation, you'll have an idea. But what I want to talk about is, what in the world is this? I was always taught that this was probably something having to do with the Antichrist. But it doesn't quite work that way if we look at the biblical tradition and the text. I'm going to come to a couple of ideas really quick here. So the first is this, that we need to pay attention to what the writer of Matthew's gospel has already said. This has something to do with something else that the book of Daniel has already said. In other words, Daniel got it right. The book of Daniel actually says this. It says, quote, "His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation." This is Daniel 11:31. I believe this is the New Revised Standard Version, so it uses that more traditional language. And as we think about this, I mean, it sounds like the same thing. So how are they connected? What is it doing, right? So one of the things we need to think about is how this probably was fulfilled during history. That there was fulfillment during the Jewish struggle under Antiochus Epiphanes. And the story is told in the Apocrypha. It's told in 1 Maccabees, and you can read about this more in verses 1:54 and following, where it basically states that it gives a time and a day, and it says, "They erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering." So here we have the Daniel sort of predictive text. We have the Maccabean sort of, here's how it went down. Yeah, you following? And in Jesus' mind, it has to be linked. Like when we think about a desolating sacrilege, it's clearly something that's on the altar and not a human being who we refer to as the Antichrist. Now, I don't want to claim that everyone who has a futuristic view thinks it's always the abomination of desolation equals the Antichrist, but usually the Antichrist is in mind. And so I want to just be very clear that there is something being put on the altar. There's something happening in the temple that is gross, irreverent, and some scholars actually point to evidence that it may have even been that during this time, Antiochus Epiphanes sets up an altar to the god Zeus. So Jesus evokes that memory in this prophetic moment as he's talking to his disciples about the fall of Jerusalem. And he says, look, this thing I'm talking to you about is going to be like that thing. When this thing happens in your lifetime, you better flee for the mountains. You better get out of Dodge. It's going to be horrible. It's just like the thing that you heard Daniel talk about. It's just like the thing in our recent history. A sacrilege is coming. Something is going to desecrate the temple, just like that other time it happened. And you need to know that it is going to be terrible. It is going to be the worst. And if it were any longer, it would be utter chaos. And you who are listening wouldn't even have a chance to escape. Do you see what I'm saying? And now, of course, it's going to be utter chaos when the Romans come in and destroy everything. But Jesus seems to be saying, look, if it were a longer period, if it lasted any longer, if this time wasn't cut short to just a few years, you wouldn't even know to run. You wouldn't even know to get out of here. You would have no time. So see that as a grace in a sense. And so that's the abomination of desolation language. It comes from Daniel, and it happens during the Maccabean period. And for Jesus, it's also going to happen during the generation of the disciples. So a second image that I want to talk about in this section of our time together is Son of Man language. Son of Man, in the Common English Bible, they call it the human one. And I make this caveat. Some people don't like that translation. I tend to think it's really actually great, because Son of Man is simply saying this is what it looks like when God is sort of the human one. In other words, this is the one who is truly human. I kind of dig that. But either way, we'll stick to the Son of Man language for here. But here's what it says in Matthew 24. Now we're going to be in verse 29 through 35. So skipping ahead just a little bit. And this is what it says. Now, immediately after the suffering of that time, the sun will become dark and the moon won't give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the planets and other heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then the sign of the human one will appear in the sky. At that time, all the tribes of the earth will be full of sadness, and they will see the human one coming in the heavenly clouds with power and great splendor. He will send his angels with the sound of a great trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from the four corners of the earth, from one end of the sky to the other. Learn this parable from the fig tree. After its branch becomes tender and it sprouts new leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all of these things, you know that the human one, Son of Man, is near at the door. Verse 34. I assure you that this generation won't pass away until all of these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words certainly will not pass away. End quote of Jesus there. There is so much in this text. There's so much here. And I realize that we don't have time to unpack all of it and do all of it justice. But I want to make a couple of quick notes. Again, you're going to notice that apocalyptic language, we covered that. It's hyperbole. It's exaggerated language that usually talked about political catastrophe using cosmic catastrophe language. And we also notice that the one coming in the heavenly clouds, this is an image of God's power and authority. Again, this all points back to the Daniel image. And there's trumpets and there's all these things. And it has to do with the Son of Man, Jesus, after a time of suffering, being vindicated to God's throne, ascending, not descending, right? So Jesus ascends to heaven, and Jesus then will be ascended to God's throne. And the way it looks is the institution that killed Jesus is now, unfortunately, because it's still sad, going to be leveled, and it will be sort of a sign that Jesus truly is who he says he was, because the words of this prophecy have come true. And now, lest you think that Jesus is harsh here, notice that we have another passage as Jesus approaches Jerusalem where he weeps over Jerusalem because he is sad. He knows what's going to happen. It's not something that Jesus thinks is awesome. Jesus grieves that this is going to happen. But what it means in a very clear way is that the Son of Man has been elevated, vindicated, sort of been justified for all of the suffering. Now he is justified against that suffering as the world's true Lord. And so that's a really big thing that we need to keep in mind. And this image, again, it's apocalyptic, and so it's meant to be to provoke something in us. And so angels or messengers, depending on your translation choice there, that word actually means the same thing. So it can mean messengers, like people who go out and share the good news of Jesus. Like, you're going to go gather people. You're going to go gather my community, and they all are going to know and experience the truth and beauty of my reconciling message of grace. And they're going to come from all over the known world, you know? You can also just mean those Jewish followers who decide to be Jesus followers, I should say, and they're Jewish and they're scattered at this time in history. They're not just in Jerusalem. And so all of the messengers that go out are essentially metaphorically gathering all of those who will be faithful to Jesus after all of this happens. And this will be the ongoing movement of the church. And so again, we see some really important language here. But what we need to make sure we understand is that Daniel 7 gives us the clarity we need. This is about, well, there's some foreign monsters who come and attack Israel. Israel is always kind of has this corporate image of the Son of Man. So the Son of Man represents Israel. Israel is the Son of Man. It's God's Son. You know, there's all of these sort of corporate individual parallels that you have to take note of in biblical language. And at the end of it all, the monsters who oppress and attack Israel, those same kinds of monsters that oppress and attack Jesus on the cross, after the suffering is done, they are vindicated. They're released from suffering. They are elevated above the enemies. And the one like the human being, or the one like a Son of Man, ascends to the throne. So that's the Son of Man language here. Again, if we're not careful, we read this and we think, oh, this is all about the future. But again, the key is already in the text in verse 34. I assure you that this generation won't pass away until all of these things happen. And Jesus isn't saying until the end of the world happens, like is often accused of him. This is actually, no. These things, the kinds of things where the Son of Man is vindicated, where the destruction happens, where there's this gathering of the faithful that's going to happen through the mission of the apostles and those that they disciple, right? All of that's going to happen within your generation. And nothing's going to take this away. These words are true. Heaven and earth could pass away, another hyperbole, right? But these words, they're just not going anywhere. So again, we have to hold this. So we understand there's an abomination of desolation we need to unpack, which we've done. Son of Man language coming back. This isn't a return in the real sense. It's a vindication to the heavenly throne after suffering. And then, of course, though, we get one more image that I want to talk about. Taken and left. This, my friends, is probably one of the hardest ones, right? So we've made it through all this stuff and we're like, okay, we can root this in the first century. It makes sense. It's not tied to Revelation in any weird way. It's all about the destruction of the temple and the vindication of the human one, who is Jesus, who rose from the dead over his enemies and now will be seated at the right hand of God as the human one who represents God's people. Okay, all of that. We get that. But then you get to verse 36 and following, and it's like, but dude, that totally sounds like rapture, doesn't it? Doesn't it? And I want to talk about why it doesn't. And then we're going to have a couple of quotes. I'm going to borrow some content from N.T. Wright here in a moment, and then I'll make a few final observations here in the next, let's say, 5 minutes or so. So here we go. Verse 36 says this, but nobody knows when that day or hour will come, not the heavenly angels and not the Son. Only the Father knows. As it was in the time of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the human one. In those days, before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. They didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. The coming of the human one will be like that. At that time, there will be 2 men in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore, stay alert. You don't know what day the Lord is coming. But you understand, if the head of the house knew at what time the thief would come, he would keep alert and wouldn't allow the thief to break into his house. Therefore, you also should be prepared, because the human one, the Son of Man, will come at a time you don't know. So we'll stop there, and that's Matthew 24:36-44. And we'll kind of just notice a couple of things here, right? So nobody knows the day or the hour, right? So what does Jesus say you can know? Well, in the previous set of passages, he clearly says, look, you can know that it's going to happen before the end of this current generation of people. Like before your people are gone, before the people you love are gone, this generation. This cataclysmic thing where the Son of Man is vindicated and Jerusalem is leveled, it's bound to happen. It's going to. You can be sure of it. But what we don't get to know is what day or hour, the exact timing of when it's all going to go down. We'll have some things to take note of. You know, there's things that we can notice. We can sort of notice the signs of the time, which we could, again, if we were looking at the Luke version or we were looking at the whole of the Olivet Discourse, of course, there's things to take note of. And when these things happen, you run for your life, right? But as far as the exact timing, you're just not going to know. So just be alert and get ready to get out of Dodge when it looks like it might be about to go down. And it's really interesting if you think about it, because so many people have made such a big deal, and this passage gets used pretty interestingly, right? No one knows the day or the hour. So whenever there's a rapture prediction, someone will say, but look, Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour, which I agree with in principle, right? Because, well, number one, I don't believe in a rapture. I do believe in the return of Jesus, and that's been a core element of this course. But besides that, no one knows the day or the hour. Well, actually, we can get pretty close to what Jesus was talking about, because we know that in 70 CE, on a certain day of a certain month, the temple finally gets ransacked, right? So we actually do, because this is in our past, but was in Jesus and the disciples' future. Do you see what I'm saying? Like no one knows the day or the hour was true for Jesus. Like Jesus didn't even know, like in his human state where he emptied himself of all of the sort of gifts of knowledge that Jesus had as the eternal Son, the eternal member of the Trinity, we would say. Like Jesus doesn't get to have that as a human. Jesus limits his knowledge for the sake of us to experience what we experience. But the Father knows, like the Father has an idea, like, hey, the way this is going to play out, all roads lead to this day and this hour. Okay. So it's really important. But for regular folks, remember that story about Noah? They were merry. They thought everything was good. And then a boat started being built. And you would think that would be the sign, right? Like the sign to wake up and do something different, like snap out of it. As the boat gets bigger and bigger, now animals start getting on this boat. These are the signs that Jesus is like, look for those kinds of signs, like notice what's going on. But they didn't even notice that. And so when the flood came, what happens? They're like, oh my goodness, what up? Yeah, we're drowned, right? So that's kind of the logic here. And so hopefully you get what Jesus is doing here. And again, the vindication of the Son of Man is represented by the very thing that mourns God/Jesus' heart, the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Israel's central city, Jerusalem and its temple. So, taken and left, well, what kinds of people will be taken and left? Well, it makes sense. Like, hey, Roman soldiers come into your town, and a couple of women are grinding at the mill because that's what they have to do as they try and stay part of the fortified city of Jerusalem, where the rebels of Jerusalem are resisting Rome. Of course, like they still need to eat. So there's going to be women at the mill and they're going to get ransacked. And you know what? One's going to get taken, and that's a bad thing. Jesus is saying, look, this is bad. The other is left. Why is she left? Who knows? Maybe she ran really well. It doesn't matter. The idea is getting taken is bad news, not good news. It's not, oh, I got taken because I'm getting raptured. Like that would be a positive message. This is not a positive message. This is not. This is bad news. It's kind of like a thief coming into your house and you don't know that that thief's going to come into your house, and you lose your emotional and every kind of security you can think of because the thief is coming to your house. Again, if this is about rapture, God is that thief and God is coming to, you get what I'm saying? These are negative images. These are not good. This is not rapture. Like, yay, I get out of here. It's, I am getting taken. I'm getting arrested. I'm getting ransacked. This is not good. And so, again, being alert, being ready, you need to know that a time is coming and you need to run for your life. You need to run for the hills, or else you're going to be one of the ones who gets taken, and rather than being one who is left. So that's kind of the idea here. And as we wrap up this session, again, I hope you see that, okay, there are complicated sentences in the Olivet Discourse that may feel very futuresque. There's even a couple of passages where I might say, okay, maybe Jesus turns towards the future. Like maybe some of this angel stuff and the four corners stuff is like, okay, after all this goes down, the angels, the messengers are going to have a mission in the world to gather, to baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Spirit, right? Like maybe that's a thing. Maybe that is. I don't know. But what I do know is that we can read all of this through the lens of this one real event. N.T. Wright, I'm going to read two quotes and make a couple of quick observations as we close this session, knowing that, well, it's kind of a longer one, but hopefully it's been a helpful longer one. Quote, N.T. Wright says this, quote, Jesus had set his face prophetically against Jerusalem. He had staked his prophetic reputation upon the claim that the temple would be destroyed. In the light of this, those who claimed to be his followers were bound to see the continuing existence of Herod's temple and the city which housed it as a paradox. Jesus would not be vindicated as a true prophet until it was destroyed by enemy action. But it was not only Jesus who would be vindicated when the temple fell. The temple represented the heart of the system from which flowed one source at least of the persecution suffered by the early church. Its destruction would be their salvation. Mark 13 said as much, end quote. Now, if I can nuance right here, and I'm going to nuance him because I may have a difference of opinion just in this one nuanced way, and maybe he would agree with this. But the point is, I want to be very clear that this is not Jesus celebrating that the temple is falling. I don't even think it's necessarily the early church celebrating the temple's fall either. Many of them identified with the temple. They didn't disagree with their Judaism. They were just Jewish who also had Jesus. They were Messianic Jewish folks, those who were followers of Christ. And so it's very important that you don't say, well, then they hated the Torah, they hated Judaism, they became this brand new thing. Well, yes, it became a brand new thing, but it was a brand new expression of Judaism, not a brand new other thing, if that makes sense. And so it's very important that when the temple fell, it's not like they clapped their hands with joy for all of the violence. They probably mourned. They probably hated seeing the temple destroyed. However, there was this other side of the coin that at least Jesus's words were really true, that Jesus knew what was going on. Jesus predicted something that actually happened by enemy action, not by God's action, if that makes sense. And so that's something I just want to fit in there. One more quote by N.T. Wright, and we'll wrap it up. Quote, "Often the voice of God can be heard in Scripture, even in ways the original writers hadn't imagined. Though you need to retain as the control a clear sense of what they did mean, in case you make Scripture prove all kinds of things, which it certainly doesn't. It is vital, therefore, to read the passage as it would have been heard by Matthew's first audience. And there, it seems, we are back to the great crisis that was going to sweep over Jerusalem and its surrounding countryside at a date that was to them in the unknown future, though we know it happened in AD 70 at the climax of the war between Rome and Judea." End quote. N.T. Wright gives us some great parameters to say, let's stick with the meaning of the text, the history of the text, and sure, perhaps it points towards the future in a metaphorical sense, but certainly not in a primary sense. And so what are we left with? Here's a couple of ideas. Number one, the timing of the coming of the human one is unclear. Just that it will happen within a generation of the original hearers. And it was not unclear to us anymore, but unclear to them. Number two, everything will seem normal. It'll be like Noah's day until the great catastrophe comes and devastates many lives. And then three, some will be taken by invading authorities and some will be left behind when this all takes place. This is a big deal. But here's the biggest idea I think the passage teaches that we can apply to our own lives. Be prepared. Be ready. Be the kind of person who follows Jesus so closely that when these situations arise, you know exactly what it's going to take to lean into the struggle and come out of the struggle with God's love and generosity fueling every part of who you are. We don't know what the future will bring. Even now, we don't know what the future will bring. But how are we living prepared for what life may bring us today, tomorrow? Are we reading the signs of our own times and leaning into the way of Jesus, showing the world around us prophetically through our community, through our churches? How are we showing the world around us that the way of Jesus makes us different? That is the invitation of a passage like this, not to worry about doom and gloom, but to pick up a shovel, pick up a rake, and ask ourselves, what will it look like to be part of building up gardens that can come into kingdom-looking bloom?
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.